Welcome back to our sacred space where we're discussing the theme dreaming as part of Newman Lumen. And I'm so excited for this morning because Reverend Julie Tonnesen, will be speaking to us. And this whole time in this role, this is my third year at Elon, I assumed Julie had spoken before because Julie is an Elon grad. She's also been at Elon since 2016 in different roles. And right now, she currently serves as the LEAF, which stands for Lutherans, Episcopalians, and Friends, campus minister, and our Spirit and Pride coordinator. Spirit and Pride is a partnership between Elon's Gender and LGBTQIA Center and the Truett Center, and the idea is to talk about the overlap of sexuality and spirituality. So there's a whole group of interns, and Julie and Luis take the lead on that. So Julie also has an MDiv from Duke Divinity School, and she is an ordained Lutheran pastor, minister, ELCA, and she is currently an associate pastor at Macedonia Lutheran Church in Burlington. I've known Julie since I started at Elon in 2019 and have been inspired by her, and she has been consistent in my own journey and pursuit of graduate school and divinity school. And I think all of the lovely people sitting here would agree that Julie brings a light that is indisguisable. Like, there's no way to hide Julie's light. So we're excited to hear more from her this morning. After Julie speaks, we'll hear again from Hannah and Wiley, and then next week we'll hear from Daniel Castillo, who is our alumni engagement officer, one of a few, and gospel choir will be performing. So make sure you come next week for that. And then once we're done, we'll join in the McBride gathering space for refreshments and breakfast. So without further ado, here's Julie.
So last fall, Allison started to touch on this. I made the mistake of sharing with her during one of our staff meetings that I had never, in fact, spoken at Newman Lumen, even though I've been a fairly regular attender since its inception. Little did I know that Allison was beginning to plan for the spring lineup of speakers, and the next thing I knew, the ask hit my inbox, and as the story goes, the rest is history. I need to confess to y'all that I feel like the absolute least qualified person to talk about dreaming, which is quite unfortunate because you've probably come here this morning to hear me share some of my thoughts about just that. So I'll offer my apologies on the front end if you don't walk away from this time together with whatever you are expecting. As I was bouncing around ideas for what I might say with my partner Dave, I told him that it was going to be challenging for me to talk about dreaming because I was really more of a nightmare kind of person. He warned me that this was probably something I didn't want to share with a room full of my colleagues and students, but I feel that it's best to be honest, so here we are. Anyways, as someone who lives under the weight of generalized anxiety disorder, dreaming has never really been my thing. Making room in my headspace for dreaming has always been a challenge because my mind tends to stay fairly busy, coming up with ways in which everything could go wrong. After I've arrived at each consecutive worst-case scenario, I then overcompensate by coming up with a backup plan and solution for each nightmare situation. All of this is to say that allowing myself and even carving out the time for my mind to entertain the idea that things might go right, that my dreams might actually come true, is not something that comes naturally to me. It's felt less scary, less anxiety-inducing to prepare myself for disappointment than to revel in the possibility of what could be. Continuing in the spirit of full disclosure, I'll share with y'all that being an ordained pastor and working in university, religious, and spiritual life was never my dream. Not because I'm not deeply fulfilled and passionate about this work, but because I never really had much of a dream for what my career might look like while I was an adolescent or undergrad. However, I was crystal clear about what I didn't want to do with my life, And that was to be a pastor, so clearly the joke is on me. Not only my dad, but my grandfather and several of my uncles are Lutheran ministers. Sunday dinner tables were often the site of dramatic retellings of ministry-related war stories, so I entered college quite certain that church work was not for me. My mom and several other women in my family were and are teachers, and while I knew their work wasn't easy, I also knew that I valued education, that I liked working with kids, and that while I may not have been passionate about it, that teaching was definitely something that I could do. As such, I applied for the North Carolina Teaching Fellows Program, was awarded the scholarship, and placed at Elon for my undergraduate studies. I had and still have a soft spot for working with awkward and uncertain preteens, so I declared middle grades education as my major, and by process of elimination, as I was pretty terrible at math and science, language arts, and social studies as my areas of concentration. After I graduated from Elon in 2014, I was quickly hired to teach 8th grade social studies at Kaiser Middle School in Greensboro. My first year of teaching was the single hardest and perhaps most miserable thing I have ever done. But I chalked it up to the fact that your first year of doing anything is always going to be a challenge. I entered my second year with a renewed energy, ready to take on whatever challenges or chairs might be thrown my way. But by the fall, I knew that something was not right. While it took me a while to admit it to myself and verbalize it to others, I knew that I was not doing what I needed to be doing. I knew that I was not where I needed to be. The problem was that I had no clue what I needed to do or where I needed to be, or at least that's what I told myself. So, as one with an anxiety disorder does on the precipice of a quarter-life crisis, I panicked. I spent my days miserably trying to impart some knowledge about the economic impacts of the Civil War to 13-year-olds, and my nights miserable because for the first time in my life, I didn't have a plan, and I couldn't anticipate what was next. All that I knew was that for my health and well-being, I needed to make a change, and soon. Through a series of events that are simultaneously too mystical and too convoluted to try and explain here, I began to recall the voices of folks I'd previously shut out, who throughout my life had shared with me that they thought I might be called to Christian ministry. I began to acknowledge the butterfly in my gut that now felt more like a swarm of bees, that perhaps some divine force was leading me down this path that I'd all but sworn off. While all of the pastors I knew and loved in my family were men, I'd been fortunate to have several incredible female ministers throughout my life, and under the comforting shelter of their wings, for the first time in my life, I allowed myself to dream about what my life as an ordained pastor in the Lutheran Church might look like. Because y'all have heard my bio, you essentially know the rest of my story. I finally worked up the courage to apply to Duke Divinity School, got in and began my studies there, as well as my candidacy in the ordination process in the Lutheran Church. Simultaneously, I began back here at Elon, working part-time with Leaf to assist the former campus minister and to fulfill a program requirement at Duke for field hours. And while I know that it sounds so hokey, I finally had this undeniable sense that I was doing exactly what I needed to be doing, that I was exactly where I needed to be. The dream that I never knew I had, or perhaps more accurately, the dream that I never allowed myself to acknowledge, was finally coming true. And it continues to grow and expand, and it reveal itself to me to this day. And I'm more grateful than I can adequately express that it has brought me to this moment. Last week, in her Newman Lumen reflection, the incredible Elle Fiedler said of her own story that just because this isn't my dream life doesn't mean that this isn't a good life. This struck a chord for me because for the large majority of my life, I never imagined, never dreamed that my life would look the way it does today. And yet, goodness abounds. And so my hope, or perhaps my dream for each of y'all this day, is that regardless of whether you're exactly where you always dreamed you'd be, or if you find yourself in the last place you ever thought you'd be, or perhaps somewhere in between, that goodness would find you and that you'd know it deeply in your bones. Quite frankly, friends, I'm still not certain what the next chapters of my dream look like. But as Reverend Michael Curry, presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, says in his book, Love is the Way, dreams are love's visions. Dreams are love's visions. My anxious mind takes comfort in these words because they remind me that when we can muster up even the tiniest drop of courage and allow ourselves to dream, that we are guided by a love which has already gone ahead of us to light the way. In closing, I'd like to offer this poem entitled For Those Who Have Far to Travel by Jan Richardson. She wrote it with the Christian season of Epiphany in mind, but I think that it applies to any and all of us who have an uncertain path laid out before us, which is to say, all of us. If you could see the journey whole, you might never undertake it, might never dare the first step that propels you from the place you have known toward the place you have not. Call it one of the mercies of the road, that we see it only by stages as it opens before us, as it comes into our keeping step by single step. There is nothing for it but to go, and by our going, take the vows the pilgrim takes, to be faithful to the next step, to rely on more than the map, to heed the signposts of intuition and dream, to follow the star that only you will recognize, to keep an open eye for the wonders that attend the path, to press on beyond distractions, beyond fatigue, beyond what would tempt you from the way. There are vows that only you will know, the secret promises for your particular path, and the new ones you will need to make when the road is revealed by turns you could not have foreseen. Keep them, break them, make them again. Each promise becomes part of the path. Each choice creates the road that will take you to the place where at last you will kneel, to offer the gift most needed, the gift that only you can give, by turning to go home another way. May it be so. Amen.